The Swap Club of Colorado Springs proudly presents the man who made zigmanship synonymous with salesmanship, Mr. Ziglar.
There's a fellow in New York City. He needed to get to Boston. He went over and he bought a ticket. He had a few minutes to kill, and so he stepped up on a pair of scales, dropped his penny in, and down came his fortune. Said, "Your name is John Jones. You weigh 188 pounds. You're going to catch the 220 to Boston." He looked at it and he said, "My goodness, that's right, but how did they know?" "Oh, I know, the guy at the ticket counter signaled somebody over here in the scales, but I'll fox him." He pulled his coat up, and he stepped back up on the scales. He put another penny in. His fortune came down again. "Your name is still John Jones. You still weigh 188 pounds. You're still going to catch the 220 to Boston." Well, this really got to him. He picked his suitcase up, went in the men's room, completely changed clothes, and came back out. This time he stepped on the scales, put his penny in, his fortune came back down. "Your name is still John Jones. You still weigh 188 pounds. But you just missed the 220 to Boston." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have not traveled 2,000 miles to tell you some stories. I have traveled 2,000 miles, however, to attempt to sell you something. I want to sell you tonight on you. You see, the average person is not sold on himself. He doesn't really believe that he's going to get those things out of life that he really wants to get. Insurance companies tell us, and I'm sure they're right, that if we were to take 100 young men aged 25 and start them on this journey that we call life, trace them all the way through until they're 65 years old, of those who are living, only 5 of them have actually made it financially. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "The great tragedy in this country today is not the waste of natural resources, not the loss of water power or minerals or what have you, though that is a great waste. He said the tragedy comes in the fact that most men go to their grave with their music still in them. The most beautiful melodies in all the world are never played simply because the average man never quite knows how to get them out." In Oklahoma some years ago, they discovered oil on some property belonging to some Indians. And one old Indian particularly had all of a sudden become wealthy. And all of his life he had wanted, in the teenage vernacular of the day, had wanted wheels. He never had even had a wagon. So now he goes uptown and buys the biggest, blackest, longest Cadillac automobile he could find. And back in those days, they used to put 2 spare tires on the back. But he wanted the biggest, so this time, instead of just putting 2, he added 4 more to it. And picture, if you will, this old Indian as he's riding down the main street of this hot, dusty little Oklahoma cowtown. Had on an Abraham Lincoln stovepipe hat. He had on coat and tails. He always wore his tie, and he always had a big black cigar sticking out of his mouth. And this old Indian was a friendly old soul. And as he would ride down the street, he would speak to people as he would see them. He would turn to the left and speak, and he would turn to the right and speak. And then, for fear he might have missed someone, he would always turn completely around and speak to those people that he might have missed. History tells us that not once did he ever run into anyone or run over anyone. He never did any property damage. He never did any physical damage, because right in front of this beautiful automobile, there were 2 beautiful horses pulling it. Local mechanics said the car was mechanically sound. Nothing was wrong with it. But the old Indian never had learned how to reach up and switch on the ignition. There were 100 horses ready and raring to go. He was using only 2. Psychologists tell us that this is the story of man today. There's a lot of power, there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of good in. But in many instances, as a matter of fact, the vast majority of the cases, the man doesn't know how, or at any rate, never goes about getting the most good out of himself. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to tell you tonight that there's no such thing as a business failure. We have only people failures. And if we have people failures, then we have people problems. And if we have people problems, then what we need to be concerned with essentially will be the humanics of people more so than the mechanics of business itself. I'm from Mississippi. I was raised next door to some rich folks. I know they were rich because not only did they have a cook, but the cook had something to cook. And ladies and gentlemen, in 1932, this was a sure sign of wealth. Her name was Maud. She was a big person in so many ways. She was happy about a lot of things, and she laughed a great deal. And when Maud laughed, she laughed all over, and every bit of her enjoyed it. I was over there one day for lunch, as I tried to be most every day for lunch, and Maud brought the biscuits out. And I took one look at them, and they were about as thick as a silver dollar. And I said, Maud, what in the world happened to your biscuits? Maud reared back and laughed, and she said, well, I'll tell you about them biscuits. She said they squatted to rise, but they just got cooked in the squat. Now, how many people do you know who fit this category? They're the people who are going to do something, but it's always tomorrow. Or they've half a mind to do it, and this is their problem. You see, the half-a-minders and the gonna-doers are the never-doers. A high jumper broke a world's record, and somebody said, how did you do it? He said, it was very simple. I threw my heart over the bar, and the rest of me followed. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you tonight that it does not take much of a man or even much of a woman to get out of life what she really wants. They don't have to be extremely well educated, extremely attractive physically. They don't have to have a bubbling personality or any of these things, although we advise the development of any of these assets that we have. But the one person that is required if we really want to get out of life what we really want, we have to have this little word called dedication. It doesn't take much of a person, but it does take every single bit of him. Once we recognize as a basic fact that where we're going and how fast we're going to get there rests in our own hands, then we've taken the first giant step toward getting what it is that we really want. Our second step comes when we go about the business of setting the proper goals. Now, goals, in my opinion, should be of three kinds. Number one, they should be big. And the reason they should be big is quite simple. There's nothing exciting about mediocrity. And it takes excitement in today's market to get the big job done. It takes a goal that's so big that you literally have to set yourself on fire. Then the world gathers around and watches you burn as you go for the big goal. Yes, the goal needs to be big, and it also needs to be long range. It needs to be long range because it's the long range goal that helps us to overcome the short range frustrations that we are inevitably going to encounter as we go about our daily way of life. And then it needs to be daily. You see, we've got to have something to do tomorrow. The salesman who wakes up without his schedule well laid out is the man who wakes up unemployed. The man needs a daily taskmaster if he's going to get that big goal. Several years ago, while sitting in my living room, I had one of my salesmen. This is when I was in the cookware business. We were talking about, this was the latter part of the year, and we were talking about next year, and I said, what are your plans? He broke out in a big old grin, and he said, well, I'll guarantee you I'll sell more next year than I've sold this year. And I said, well, how much have you sold this year? And again, he kind of smiled, and he said, well, now I don't know exactly. Now, here's an interesting thing. Here's a boy who didn't know where he was, had no idea where he had been, and yet he honestly thought he knew where he was going. And before you laugh, do you know where you are? Do you know where you've been? And if you can't answer these two questions, how can we realistically, honestly expect to know where we're going? So I talked with him a moment. I said, how would you like to become an immortal in the cookware business? Well, that's a pretty highfalutin word in anybody's language. So he said, I would like it. How do I do it? And I said, well, first of all, break the company's all-time record. And he looked at me and kind of grinned, and he said, well, that's impossible. Well, one thing about attempting the impossible, folks, is the fact that you have very little competition. So we talked about this for a moment. He said, I'll let you know. On December the 26th, he called me from his home in Augusta, Georgia, and he said, I've made a decision. I said, what is the decision? He said, I'll break the all-time record. And I said, how? Well, he said, you know, since our last conversation, I've done some figuring. I know exactly how much business I'm going to get every time I open my briefcase. I know how much business I get when I put on a demonstration. I know how much business I get every time I knock on a door. So he said, I've got it all figured out. I know how much I've got to sell for the year. But more important, I know what I'm going to do for the month, for the week, for the day, and even for the hour. And I said, you just broke the record. Simply because not once did you use the word if. It was not an if decision, it was a decision, period. This is what I'm going to do. Ladies and gentlemen, the most this young man had ever sold in any one year was $34,000. And I don't know if any of you have ever sold pots or not. I did for many years. That's a lot of pots in anybody's language. But the next year, selling the same product in the same territory to the same people at the same price under the same economic conditions, he delivered and paid for over $104,000 worth of cookware. And what did he do? Did he get that much smarter? Why, certainly he got some smarter, because now instead of 10 years experience, he's got 11. Did he work that much harder? Why, yes, he worked some harder. But most important, he worked in a more organized manner. But ladies and gentlemen, the reason I tell you the story, the thing that made the difference, is what I will be able to teach you during the next 30 seconds. The thing that enabled him to more than triple his business was quite simple. He learned how to train fleas. Now, how many of you folks here tonight know how to train fleas? May I see your hands, please? Well, it looks like I got here just in time. I'll tell you, folks, you'll just never make it big until you know how to train fleas, and that's a fact. And since that is a fact, how many of you want to know, have got to know how to train fleas? Let me see your hands. Hey, we're going to have a big group of flea trainers here, I'll say that. Well, you know, you put fleas in jars and they jump. And those fleas will jump up and they'll hit the top over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then after a period of time, you watch them. They continue to jump, but all of a sudden they no longer hit the top. And then it's a matter of fact that you can take the top off and they'll keep right on jumping. But there's no danger that they're going to jump out. You see, they've conditioned themselves. They have learned through experience that they can only do so much, and this is all they're going to do. Once they figure this is all I can do, it becomes a physical fact. They can do no more, and man is the same way. You see, the average man is what we call a sniop. That's spelled S-N-I-O-P. It means he's susceptible to the negative influence of other people. We've seen it happen in the world of athletics all the time. For instance, you remember years ago when all the athletes said, I'll go out and break the mile barrier. I'll run it in less than 4 minutes. They'd get out and they'd toe the line and they'd say, I'm going to break it. But deep down they knew they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't was because they were sniops. They'd been listening to the coach. The coach had said, He'd had his watch out. He had timed them. You can't run it in less than 4 minutes. They'd been to the doctor. The doctor had examined them. They said, you can't do it. The physical body will not stand the exertion. And so the athlete knew that he couldn't do it because he was a sniop. And ladies and gentlemen, it took a flea trainer to break the 4-minute barrier. That's right. Dr. Roger Bannister is perhaps the best-known flea trainer of all time. Now, you see, a flea trainer essentially, as you probably have already guessed, is simply someone who is influenced and driven from within rather than someone who is driven from without. Now, folks, this is National Attitude Week, or Right Attitude Week for you here tonight. I think I could safely say this, that I've talked to coaches, high school principals, sales managers, owners of businesses all over this continent, and I have never heard one of them yet that did not agree that your right mental attitude was extremely important. It's the most important single thing of all. So I'm not going to spend any time at all tonight trying to sell you on the value of being positive or on the value of being optimistic. So you know what an optimist is. It's a guy that periodically shows up at the license bureau to see if his wedding license has expired. I'm just teasing. I've been happily married 11 years myself. That's not bad out of 20, is it? You know, ladies and gentlemen, the thing that has impressed me and what I'm now going to talk about essentially is this. We all agree that the attitude is important. So what I'm going to devote this time to now simply is how to develop this right mental attitude. Let me ask you a question. If I can tonight give you a formula that will involve no effort, that will require no work, cost you no money, and take no time, say that price is good, isn't it? But if you will follow this formula for 3 weeks until it becomes a part of you, 2 things will happen. Number 1, you'll have a lot more fun out of life. And number 2, you'll make a great deal more money. How many of you will be willing, without me even telling you what it is, to give it a 3-week test? Could I see your hands, please? Wonderful. Just about everybody here has agreed to do it. First of all, we've got to understand one thing. We've got to understand how the mind essentially works before we can learn how to control it, and hence how to control our attitude. Number 1, the mind follows whatever instructions we give it. The problem is the fact that the average man either doesn't understand this or else he gives himself the wrong instruction. Let me give an illustration. We say ridiculous things like, I can't remember names. I can't get started in the morning. We head out on a picnic and we look up, and we say, I hope it doesn't rain. We head uptown to go shopping and say, I bet I can't find a parking space. The fat person sits down at the table and says, everything I eat turns to fat. A mother sends her child off to school and says, now don't get run over. Now really, how ridiculous can we get when you get right down to it? It's a fact. If you plant beans in your garden, if anything comes up, it'll be beans. If you plant potatoes, if anything comes up, it'll be potatoes. This is the law of the universe. Had you been born in China, listened to the Chinese language all of your life, heard Chinese ideology all of your life, you, my friend, would be a Chinaman. It's the law of the universe that whatever you put into your mind is exactly what has got to come out of it. And if you plant a negative over and over and over, a negative has got to come out. If you plant a positive, then a positive has got to come out. Does this make sense to you, ladies and gentlemen? Will you please say yes if it makes sense to you? Yes. It does. It's just logic. It's the law, actually, of the universe. Ladies and gentlemen, most of us get up by an alarm clock. Here's where we're going to have some fun now. The average person, when he sets his alarm, he makes a decision. He says, tomorrow morning I am going to get up. So when the alarm goes off, he doesn't then decide again to get up. He decided that last night. What he does decide is, how am I going to get up? And there's 2 ways to do it. The average person, when he hears the alarm goes off, he said, oh no. Whew, hon, do you mean to tell me it's 7 o'clock already? And we got to get out. Nobody's buying anything today. This is one way to do it, but it ain't right. I'll tell you that for sure. There's another way, and this one is right. When that alarm clock goes off, the first thing you do is you turn over and you switch it off. Then you sit straight up in bed, you pop your hands, and you say, oh boy, it's a good day to get up and go to work. Now, get this picture, if you will. There you sit. You're on the side of the bed, and you're just about 3/4 asleep. And you're saying, oh boy, it's a good day to get up to work. See how ridiculous can you get? And this is part of it. You've already done 2 things, though. Number 1, you're up. And this is where you wanted to be when you set the alarm. And number 2, you have taken the first definite step towards gaining control of this mind of yours. And this is the important thing. Then you go in and you take that shower. And while you're taking that shower, you start to sing something peppy and cheerful. Will James, the father of American psychology, says, we do not sing because we're happy. We are happy because we sing. You cannot be negative at the top of your voice. Try it sometimes. The physical expression, the physical act of what you're doing is going to make the mental acceptance so very, very easy. If I live to be 138, I'll never forget what happened in New Jersey one time when I was going through this. I spoke at a real estate convention, and 2 days later I was back in the same area, and I walked in this one particular office, and these 2 guys sitting in front just almost fell out of their chairs. And I said, what's the matter with you guys? One of them says, you better not come in here. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, do you remember the rather heavy-set lady that was sitting on the front row yesterday? I said, with the black dress on? He said, yeah. He said, you almost cost her and her husband their jobs. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, she listened to every word you said. Said she went home and she set that alarm clock, and then the next morning when it went off, she sat straight up in bed and she popped her hands. She said, oh boy, it's a good day to get up and go to work. She went in that shower and she turned that water on and she started singing. And when she came out of that shower, she was real happy. And she said her husband saw how good she felt, and neither one of them went to work that day. So you take your shower. You go into the kitchen, and I know you guys have had bacon and eggs every day for the last 281 days, but today you sit down at the table, you pop your hand, you say, honey, do you mean to tell me we've got bacon and eggs for breakfast this morning? That's what I was hoping we'd have. I'll tell you, fellas, the shock value alone. It's worth their price of. You see what you're doing here? You know, the average person starts every day either in neutral or in reverse. What do we mean by this? Well, let's suppose a customer calls you early in the morning and says, Bob, by gollies, I just wanted to call you and tell you what a nice guy you are. I want you to know we appreciate your looking after our interests, and we want some more business done with you. Could you come over at 10 o'clock? Well, boy, oh boy, oh boy. How is he going to start his day? His wife's going to have to pull him down so she can shove him out the door, isn't she? Absolutely, because he feels tremendous. But on the other hand, suppose you're driving uptown, minding your own business, and all of a sudden some idiot pulls out of the side and almost runs over, you know. What do you these crazy drivers, you know, and you tell people all day, some moron, an imbecile that probably didn't get beyond the second day of the first grade, almost ran over me this morning. You talk about it all day. Somebody that you never saw before and perhaps will never see again has told you how to feel all day long. Think about it. Think about it. So step number one we've just had, and I'm glad you agreed to do it before I told you what it was. But I'll tell you this, you'll have a lot of fun. Then we take step number two. You know, the American people are essentially so negative that they make reference to these electrical appliances on the street corners as either red lights or stop lights or traffic lights. How many of you ever heard them called that? Let me see your hands. And yet we think about it for that long. We know they're not red lights, stop lights, or traffic lights. They are go lights. They're put there for the express purpose of making traffic go, and if you don't believe it, just go switch one of them off during a busy time of the day and see what happens. Will traffic be backed up because stoplights have been turned off? Not on your life. Traffic will back up because the go lights of life have been turned off. So here's what we're going to do for step number two. From here on in, every time we make reference to these electrical appliances, we're going to call them what? Go lights, are we? Because we want to be honest about it. And here's the way you do it. You personalize them. Every one you come to, you look at it and you say, that's mine. It's put there for me so that I can go through life easier and smoother and safer, and I can get there faster to where I wanted to go. So step number two, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that we have a tremendous reminder there for us to go by every day. And then we come to step number three. And this appeals to every man or woman who's ever drawn a breath of air. Okay? Most everybody would like to get a little something for a little of nothing, wouldn't we? Now, let me tell you something. You can do it. You know, when you sit down at the telephone and you start your normal doodling, well, you got to change that doodling just a little bit. We've got to doodle according to Hall now. So when we sit down, what do? We write down, I can, I can, I can. We write it over and over and over. Then we write down what our objective is. What is it do we really want? We put it on that slip of paper and we slip it in our pocket, or we put it in our purse. Then we put it on the bathroom mirror, but most important of all, we burn it indelibly into our subconscious mind. How many of you saw Candid Camera the night that Dorothy Collins, I believe it was on, and she had a gyroscope in a suitcase? Did any of you see that particular episode? It was fantastic. I hope somebody did. Well, anyhow, this old boy would be walking down the hall, you know, grinning. And Dorothy would say, sir, would you mind picking this suitcase up and taking it over to my office? It's a little too heavy for me. So the old boy would reach down and he'd pick it up, you know, and he'd start walking. He'd try to turn, and he could turn all he wants to, but that gyroscope's set, and it's going straight. Now, why do we mention this? It's because inside of every human being there is a gyroscope. Just as there is one in a duck or in a squirrel. Take a duck. Take a young duck 1,000 miles from all other ducks, and just as surely as the night follows the day, when cold weather approaches, this duck is going south. Something's built inside of him that demands that he do this. Take a squirrel. A young squirrel that's never lived through a winter, and I'll guarantee you, He'll store nuts for the winter because there's something built inside of him that demands that he do this. Go to the seashore. Watch the sailing ship as it sails around. You'll see a lot of them. They're going in all 360 degrees of the compass, and yet we've got just one wind blowing the sail ship. And here you notice the difference between the man and the duck. You see, on the sail ship, we've got a human being. And this human being is given the right of choice of direction. He sets this gyroscope, and when he sets this gyroscope and sets it over and over and over again, then it literally becomes impossible for him to fail. You remember the cookware salesman I talked about earlier? At the first of the year, he didn't say, I'll break this record if I don't wreck my automobile. It's well that he didn't, because for over 3 weeks he had to depend on borrowed transportation. He didn't say, I will break this record if there's no illness in my family. And again, it's well that he didn't, because his youngest son had an emergency appendectomy. He didn't say, I'll break this record if there are no deaths in my family. And he buried 2 loved ones that year. He didn't say, I'll break this record if I don't lose my voice. For 19 agonizing days, with the goal in sight, he could speak scarcely a whisper. He simply said, I'll break the record, period. He set his gyroscope on January 1st. He reset it on January 2nd. He set it again on the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th, and every single day of the year he set the gyroscope so that failure literally became impossible. You see, once we have gained control of our mind, then an important difference sets in a human being. You know, essentially, the only difference between a man and a pig and a horse is his mind. You'll find everything else in the pig and the horse, and most of it is in stronger, better shape. You know, we control our mind, then we learn how to do another thing. And that simple as this. We learn how to take lemons and make lemonades out of them. Charles Kettering's lemon was a broken arm that he got cranking his car, and it kicked him. So he developed the self-starter. Charles Goodyear's lemon was a prison sentence imposed upon him because of a contempt of court charge. And while he was in prison, he developed the process for vulcanizing rubber. So now, ladies and gentlemen, that we've taken control of our mind, we've got to do something else. We've got to go to work. We've got to mention this real strong. You heard about the fellow that somebody asked him how long he'd been working for his company, and he said, ever since they threatened to fire me. You know. You know, it's true that a lot of people quit looking for work as soon as they found a job. A wise old king years ago called all of his wise men together. He said, gentlemen, I want you to compile for me the wisdom of the ages. I want you to put it in bound book form. I want to leave this so that the future generations can know some of these facts. So they went out and they worked. They came back with 12 huge volumes. And the old king looked at it and he said, this is superb, but it's too lengthy. Condense it. They worked another period of time and came back with 1 volume, and that was still too lengthy. Then they came back with a single chapter, then just a page, then only a paragraph, and finally a sentence. And the old king looked at the sentence and said, this is it. This is what we're looking for. This is the wisdom of the ages. And as soon as all men everywhere know this, then our problems will be solved. And the sentence simply said, there ain't no free lunch. I don't care what they try to tell us in Washington today. There ain't no free lunch. They might be putting some of them out on consignment. But sooner or later, somebody, as you know, is going to have to pay for them. I've got a couple of buddies down in South Alabama. The names are Bernard Haygood and Jimmy Glenn. And they were out riding through the South Alabama foothills one day, and they got a little bit thirsty. And they saw this old abandoned farmhouse. And so they pulled around to the back of the house, and old Bernard was the athletic one. So he jumped out of the car and he ran over to this old abandoned pump. And he grabbed the pump out and he said, Jimmy, you know, I just bet you it's some water down there. Let's see if we can get some. So old Jimmy said, well, Bernard, just pump away. So he started pumping. Then after a few minutes, he said, Jimmy, I expect you better go over there and get that bucket and come over here and get some water out of this stream. He said, you know, we're going to have to prime this pump just a little bit. And that's the way it is with our prospects sometimes, Sam. You know, we got to do a little priming with them. Long about then, it begins to get a little hot. It's hot in South Alabama in August, I'll tell you. Old Bernard was sweating. He said, Jimmy, I don't believe it's in the water down there. Old Jimmy said, yeah, it is, Bernard. It's just kind of deep. You got to keep pumping. You know how some of your prospects are. They want to test you. They want to find out how bad you really want to make that sale. Finally, old Bernard said, man, he said, it ain't no water down there. Jimmy said, don't stop. Man, he said, if you stop, that water goes all the way back down to the bottom. And then you got to start all over. Fellas, how is it? Do you ever get out on a sales call and the customer says, I like what you're saying. We need some more of this. Matter of fact, me and the wife was just talking about that the other day. Now, I tell you what you do. This is Wednesday night. You see me on Saturday afternoon, and I'll let you know for sure exactly what we want to do about it. So you get back Saturday afternoon, and what happened? That water's going all the way back down, and we got to get back with it. The thing that excites me about this particular illustration is one basic fact. You don't have to be smart to do this. You don't have to be personable to do this. All it is simply our right as free Americans to work as long and as hard at our task as we really want to. Folks, let me say this. There's no such thing as a lazy man. He's either sick or he's uninspired. If he's sick, we suggest that he go to the doctor. If he's uninspired, we suggest that he deliberately associate with those people who can give him inspiration. He deliberately seeks this by reading and listening to those people in whom he has a great deal of confidence. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me say this also. A lot of people are active physically, but they never quite get active from here on up. It's an interesting fact. There's not a man in this room, I question, that's worth more than $50 a week from here down. And yet everybody here would be worth a minimum of $50,000 a year from here on up. And yet we use this part of our body 8, 10, 12 hours a day and hesitate to use this one even 10 or 12 or 15 minutes a day. Think about it. It simply doesn't make sense. We've got to work mentally. We've also got to work physically. And then we bring on the equalizer. In my opinion, it's the fifth step. In my opinion, desire is the great equalizer. You give me a man who has an average ability, but tremendous desire, and I'll give you back a champion every single time. And when I think of desire, I always think of Pete Gray. When Pete Gray was a young man, he said, someday I'll play Major League Baseball. And in 1944, he did. He made it all the way to the big leagues. Played for the St. Louis Browns. In my opinion, this man today belongs in Cooperstown in the Hall of Fame. Oh, he wasn't a superstar. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even a regular. He didn't even last a year out, and as far as I know, he never hit a home run. He was too slow to be a good base runner, but Pete Gray, for my money, is an immortal, and the reason is simple. He made it all the way to the big leagues with just one arm. Not once did he ever count what he did not have. He simply took what he did have and used it to the best of his ability. You see, success in life is not determined by having been dealt the good hand, but in using the hand that you were dealt to the very best of your ability. 2 men had polio. One became a beggar on the streets of Washington, and the other was FDR. Andrew Jackson never attended a school a day of his life. He couldn't even write his name until he was a married man. And yet he became President of the United States and helped to found what we know today as the public school system. Helen Keller could have given you a million reasons, perhaps, why she should not have done anything at all, and yet her life has been an inspiration to so many people. With enough desire, we can throw in what we like to refer to as intelligent ignorance. Henry Ford had lots of this. One day he called all of his engineers in, brilliantly educated men with master's and doctor's degree, and he said, gentlemen, build for me a V8 motor. And they looked at the old man like he had lost his mind, and he said, it cannot be done. And he said, I must have a V8 motor, build me one. They went out and worked, and shortly they came back and they said, it can't be done. He said, it must be done, go build it. And again they went out, and again they came back and said, it can't be done. And for the third time he sent them out. And this time, because one man was intelligently ignorant, they came back with that V8 motor. You know, the bumblebee can't fly. We all know this. His body's too heavy, his wings are too light. Aerodynamically, it's impossible for him to do this, but the bumblebee doesn't read. The bumblebee merely flies. I have a friend in the little town of Marion, South Carolina. His name is Glenn Turner. Glenn has what most people would consider some handicaps. He has a very severe hair lip. He has an 8th grade education. But Glenn doesn't look at them as handicaps. He looks at them simply as lemons, and he wants to make lemonades with them. And this year, this young man will earn well over $100,000. He's just intelligently ignorant enough to believe that he actually has the advantage by having those handicaps, and he uses them as such. I'm going back to my storybook now as we near our close. Years ago in a cathedral in Europe, an old man sat playing the organ. All day he played it beautifully and skillfully. The church that day seemed to be particularly sad because the old man was sad. This was his last day. And at the end of the day, with the sun setting, coming through those beautiful stained glass windows, just at the close of day, the back door of the church opened, and a rather brusque young man stepped in. And the old man saw him and reached up and took the key out and switched off the organ. He headed back to the back of the cathedral, and the young man held out his hand and said, "Please, the key." And the old man handed him the key. The young man hurriedly walked up to the organ, stood very briefly in front of it just for an instant, then sat down, slipped in the key, and started to play. And while the old man had played beautifully, the young man played with sheer genius. Music such as the world had never heard before came forth. It filled the cathedral. It even filled the whole town. And this was the world's introduction to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. With tears streaming down his cheek, the old man said, "Suppose, now just suppose that I had not given the master the key." You know, each person holds the key to another's success. When Roger Bannister lifted the ceilings on the 4-minute mile, athletes the world over started running it. George Matthew Adams expressed it so beautifully when he said, "He climbs highest who helps another up." And ladies and gentlemen, if you do these things that we have talked about this evening, there are those around you who are going to say that you are different, and I'll agree with you. And I'll tell you exactly how different you are going to be. You're going to be among the 5 people out of that 100 who started in life who get out of life what you want. You're going to get not only financial rewards, but rewards that are far greater in so many other ways. There'll be others who will criticize you. But let me tell you this, to the best of my knowledge, since the history of man has begun, there has never been one single statue erected to a critic. There'll be those people who might even laugh at you. But let me say this, the little world laughed, but the big world gathered at the banks of the Hudson when Robert Fulton went steaming by. The little world laughed, but the big world was tuned in when Alexander Graham Bell made that historic phone call. The little world laughed, but the big world was at Kitty Hawk when the Wright brothers made that historic flight. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, the little world might laugh at you, but I can assure you that the big world will be at the finish line when you get where you set out to go. And I'll say this in conclusion, that what you get by reaching the destination you set out to make is not nearly so important as what you become by reaching this destination. Thank you.